Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
For some background, I've been fighting an uphill battle with my ex over our daughter for years now. Back in 2017, we agreed that he would have primary custody since I wasn't in a stable position at the time. It was the right decision then, but I've spent the last 7 years working hard to build stability in my life. I moved closer to be in the same school district as my daughter, found steady employment, and created a safe home environment. Currently, I only get every other weekend with her, which never feels like enough time. My daughter has been telling me for the past year that she doesn't feel like she belongs in her dad's home. She says her stepmother hits her hands and face when she's in trouble, and her dad makes her run laps around the house as punishment. If she refuses, they lock her outside. Last Friday, when I picked her up for our weekend visit, something was clearly wrong. She was quiet and withdrawn, nothing like her usual self. I asked her if everything was okay since she seemed down. She told me she didn't want to talk about it. I didn't push, but later that evening, she finally opened up. She confessed that she was tired of being hit all the time and tired of being yelled at. She explained that she felt like she could be herself when she was with me. My heart shattered into a million pieces. I spent the weekend trying to make her feel safe and loved, but Sunday came too quickly. When my ex arrived to pick her up, my daughter refused to leave. She said she wasn't going and didn't want to go back there. I tried to reason with her, knowing I was legally obligated to return her. I told her that I understood she was upset, but explained that she needed to go with her dad now. I mentioned we could talk about making changes, but right now, this was the arrangement we had. My ex and I tried talking to her together, but she wouldn't budge. That's when he decided to call the police. 3 officers showed up at my door. They talked to my ex first, then to me, and finally to my daughter through the kitchen window. One officer told me that I needed to comply with the custody agreement and make my daughter leave with her father. I explained that I understood that, but questioned how exactly I was supposed to physically force her when she was refusing to go. Another officer told me I needed to physically remove her from my home and even suggested that, if necessary, I could spank her to get her to comply. I was shocked. I told them I wasn't comfortable spanking my child. I pointed out that she was scared to go back because she said her stepmother hits her and asked if that concerned them. The first officer warned me that if I didn't make an effort to get her to leave, they would arrest me for parental interference. While 2 officers were threatening me, I later found out the 3rd officer was telling my daughter that I could be arrested. He also promised she could pet the police dog if she went with her dad. Using this manipulation, they got her to reluctantly agree to leave. After they left, I immediately called the supervisor to request a review of the body camera footage. I wanted to confirm if officers were really allowed to threaten to arrest a parent who wouldn't physically force their child to leave when that child was reporting physical abuse. The supervisor ignored my concerns about my daughter's safety and immediately defended his officers. I called Child Protective Services to file a report and started preparing legal documents to modify our custody agreement. Friends suggested I file for emergency custody, but I worried the judge wouldn't see this as an emergency situation. The next day, I contacted my daughter's school to alert them to the situation. Unfortunately, they don't have a regular counselor she can see, but her teacher promised to keep an eye out for any concerning behavior. I also learned that our custody agreement was filed in Washington County, which is 2 hours away from where we now live in Lane County. The clerk told me I would need to file for emergency custody by 8 a.m., which was nearly impossible since I needed to take my younger child to school at that same time. In Oregon, I can't file for joint custody unless both parties agree, which my ex never will. I also discovered I can't file for emergency custody until a modification has been filed. Without substantial evidence of abuse, my chances of getting sole custody are slim. What infuriates me most is how the system seems designed to work against protecting children. The police cared more about enforcing a custody agreement than investigating claims of physical abuse. The courts make it deliberately difficult for non-custodial parents to protect their children from harmful situations. I'm still waiting to hear back from an attorney about my options. In the meantime, I've started using a co-parenting app to document all communication with my ex. I'm requesting information about my daughter's extracurricular activities, medical appointments, and school events in writing, so I have evidence if he tries to withhold anything. Every message I send is professional and non-confrontational because I know a judge might read them someday. I'm fighting this battle the right way, even when it feels like the system is stacked against me. All I want is to protect my daughter and give her the safe, loving home she deserves. Why does that have to be so difficult? My wife and I bought our house in this quiet cul-de-sac 3 years ago. We loved the peaceful neighborhood and the large front yard that came with the property. We had dreams of our future kids playing there someday. Well, that someday came sooner than expected when my wife got pregnant last year. Everything was perfect until about 6 months ago when this guy moved in across the street. At first, he seemed normal enough, waved hello, kept to himself. Then one weekend, I noticed his new car. Not just any car, a bright red Lamborghini that probably cost more than my house. Good for him, I thought. Until the following weekend when the parade began. It started with 3 friends showing up in equally flashy sports cars. They spent the afternoon revving engines, blasting music, and basically treating our quiet street like their personal racetrack. Annoying, but I figured it was a one-time thing. It wasn't. Every weekend more cars started showing up. I later found out he'd created some Facebook group for luxury sports car owners in the area, and our cul-de-sac had become their unofficial meetup spot. The problem? My neighbor's driveway could fit maybe 3 cars max. So where did the others park? That's right, all over my front yard. When my wife went into labor, I hoped the timing might work in our favor. Maybe having a newborn would earn us some sympathy and quiet. Nope. One Saturday, about 2 weeks after we brought our baby home, they were louder than ever. After my little one woke up screaming for the 3rd time from the sound of engines revving, I decided to talk to my neighbor. I politely approached him and explained about our newborn, who was trying to sleep, and asked if he and his friends could keep the noise down. He dismissed my concerns, saying it was the middle of the day and claiming that babies could sleep through anything. He even mentioned his sister's kid supposedly sleeping through a rock concert. When I brought up the issue of his friends parking all over my property again, he brushed it off as just grass and questioned what else I was using it for. I had to remind him it was my property and I shouldn't need to explain why I didn't want strangers parking on it. He rudely told me that I had moved to a neighborhood, not a library, and that I should deal with it. I tried talking to him several more times over the next few months, but each conversation ended worse than the last. During one confrontation, he even called me a buzzkill loser in front of his friends, who all laughed like we were back in high school. I called the police a few times, but they were useless. By the time they showed up, everyone would be just hanging out with engines off, or they'd get a warning and be back at it an hour later. The cops told me there wasn't much they could do about occasional noise during daylight hours, but I had noticed something during these gatherings. They weren't just revving engines, they were drinking. A lot. And then driving those fancy cars home. It just so happens that my cousin joined the police force last year. We were catching up at a family dinner, and I mentioned my ongoing nightmare. That's when the plan started to form. My cousin asked if these guys were drinking and driving, and I confirmed they were, starting around noon and stumbling to their cars by evening. When I mentioned they were also parking on my property without permission, at least 5 or 6 cars every weekend, my cousin said he thought they could help me out. The following Saturday was the biggest gathering yet. Some car club anniversary or something. By 2 p.m. there were over 20 sports cars lining our small street. 7 of them were parked on my front lawn. The music was so loud I could feel the bass through our floorboards. My baby hadn't napped all day. I texted my cousin, "It's showtime." I watched and waited. Around 9 p.m. they started wrapping up. The ritual was always the same. They'd get in their cars, rev the engines unnecessarily loud as some kind of goodbye ceremony, then peel out of the cul-de-sac. My cousin had arranged for a DUI checkpoint right at the only exit from our cul-de-sac. What followed was beautiful chaos. Some tried to turn around but found more officers approaching from behind. Others just sat in their cars, revving engines in frustration. My neighbor was running from car to car, presumably telling his friends to play it cool. But you can't play cool when you're over the legal limit. One by one, they failed breathalyzer tests. Cars were towed, people were handcuffed. My neighbor was screaming at the officers, which only made things worse for him. By midnight, 10 sports cars had been towed away. My neighbor and several of his friends spent the night in jail. Turns out 2 of them had outstanding warrants, and one was driving with a suspended license. The next morning was the quietest our street had been in months. I sat on my porch enjoying a coffee while my baby finally napped peacefully inside. My neighbor's house stayed quiet for weeks after that. When he finally did have friends over again, it was a much smaller, much quieter gathering, and not a single car parked on my property. During my senior year of high school, I was thrilled to discover that my best friend and I were placed in the same English class. When we saw our schedules lined up for English, we were pumped. The excitement didn't last long. Students from previous years warned us about her tendency to pick favorites and target others. We heard the stories but thought maybe they were exaggerated. Turns out they weren't. A few weeks into the semester, my friend and I noticed something strange. We'd complete the same assignments, often working side by side in the library, yet our grades were drastically different. I consistently get perfect scores, while my friend would receive C's and D's on practically identical work. At first, I thought maybe our writing styles were just different enough that the teacher preferred mine. So one day I suggested that I should look over his next essay before he submitted it. I offered to edit it to match my style more closely. My friend was skeptical, wondering if that would work, suspecting that the teacher simply hated him. I told him it was worth a try since we needed to figure out what was happening. We spent hours on his next assignment. I practically rewrote it while keeping his ideas intact. We submitted our papers, confident that this would resolve the issue. When the grades came back, I had another 100%. My friend got a 75%. My friend asked if the teacher had even read the paper. I agreed with him, saying it was ridiculous and suggesting there was no way she was actually reading our assignments. As the semester progressed, the pattern continued. My grade climbed above 100% with extra credit, while my friend hovered around a C-. It was becoming painfully obvious that the teacher had decided to dislike him for some reason and wasn't even bothering to read our work. By the time our final major assignment came around, I was fed up. We were tasked with writing a 4-page report, analyzing a movie of our choice. That's when I hatched my plan. I told my friend that I was going to test if the teacher was actually reading these papers. Instead, I would just copy the lyrics to First Day Out over and over until I hit 4 pages. My friend was shocked, pointing out that the T Grizzly song was filled with cursing and inappropriate content. I confirmed that was exactly the point. If she was reading it, there was no way I'd get a good grade. If I still got an A, we'd have proof she wasn't reading the assignments. My friend warned that I would get in trouble, but I reminded him that I already had an A locked in and the worst case was that I'd fail one assignment. I submitted it and waited. Not only had I received a passing grade, but I'd gotten an A+ with a note saying, "Excellent analysis." My friend, who had actually written a thoughtful review of The Shawshank Redemption, received a B-. The next day we walked straight to the principal's office. I told the principal that we needed to show him something about our English class. When he asked what the problem was, my friend explained that we had evidence that our teacher was grading unfairly. We laid out all our assignments from the semester, showing the consistent pattern of favoritism. Then I showed the principal my movie analysis with its vulgar lyrics and perfect score. The principal's face went from confused to shocked to angry in seconds. He told us that this was completely unacceptable and that he'd be looking into it immediately. He also sternly warned me never to submit something like this again. I agreed, explaining that I just needed to prove what was happening. For a few weeks, we heard nothing. Classes continued as normal, and we assumed our complaint had been filed away and forgotten. Then, as the semester was ending, my graduation counselor pulled me aside. The counselor told me that the school board had reviewed my English assignment. She mentioned it wasn't the first complaint about that teacher, but it was definitely the most concrete evidence, and they were terminating her contract. When the new semester began, our English class had a new teacher, a substitute who later became permanent. My friend's grades immediately improved to match his actual abilities. It was probably a risky move that could have backfired badly, but sometimes you have to take a stand and say, that's enough. To this day, whenever my friend and I get together, we still laugh about how a rap song helped expose an unfair teacher and changed our senior year for the better. Ever since I was little, I've been the nervous one in class. The kid who jumps when the teacher suddenly says my name and feels sick before every big test. Having attention problems and anxiety wasn't easy. Most of the time I handled it okay, but when the Connecticut Mastery tests came around each year, it felt like a complete nightmare. For those who don't know, these were standardized tests that came about during the No Child Left Behind era. They were these awful multiple choice and short answer tests that didn't even count toward our grades. Our teachers would spend months drilling us on test material instead of teaching us anything useful or interesting. My anxiety would kick into overdrive weeks before testing began. I'd have trouble sleeping, my stomach would hurt constantly, and I'd be so stressed that I couldn't focus on anything else. My parents had taken me to doctors who confirmed my attention deficit disorder diagnosis, but back then, there weren't many accommodations for kids like me during these tests. My older brother was different. He was smart and confident, the kind of kid who would finish tests early and then get bored waiting for everyone else. We weren't super close due to our age difference, but I always looked up to him. One night, about a week before the Connecticut Mastery tests, I was sitting quietly in the living room while my brother and mom were talking. My brother mentioned to my mom that he had noticed something weird on the back page of these standardized tests. He described a box that said, "I refuse to take this test," with a line for a signature. He wondered aloud what would happen if someone actually signed it. My mom responded that she found this interesting and suggested that maybe he should sign it to find out what happens. They didn't realize I was listening, but a light bulb went off in my head. Could I actually refuse to take the test? Was that a real option? My brother eventually decided not to risk it. He was in a higher grade and worried about getting in trouble, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Those tests were pure torture for me, and if there was a legitimate way out, I wanted to take it. The day of the first test arrived. I sat at my desk, feeling sick as the teacher passed out the test booklets. She started going through the usual boring instructions. The teacher instructed us to make sure we filled in the bubbles completely, used only number 2 pencils, and read each question carefully before answering. My heart was pounding as I waited for her to finish. When she finally told us to begin, I took a deep breath, flipped my test booklet over to the back page, and there it was. The little box with "I refuse to take this test" and a signature line underneath. Without hesitating, I signed my name and raised my hand. The teacher looked annoyed as she walked over, probably thinking I had a question about the instructions. She asked me what I needed. I told her that I had signed the refusal box. I'll never forget how all the color drained from her face. Her eyes widened and her mouth opened, but no words came out for a few seconds. The teacher repeated my statement in disbelief, asking if I had really done that. I explained that I had refused to take the test, pointing out that the form said I could do that right there. She grabbed my test booklet and stared at the back page. Then she looked at me like I had just grown a second head. She told me to wait there. She hurried out of the classroom, leaving the other students looking confused. Some of them started whispering, but I just sat there, suddenly feeling calmer than I had in weeks. About 10 minutes later, the principal walked in. The principal was always intimidating with that perfect suit and stern expression. The principal asked me to come with them. In the office, they called my mom. I sat there worried that I was in major trouble, but also feeling weirdly proud of myself for standing up to the system. When my mom arrived, she didn't look upset at all. In fact, she had this little smile that told me she was on my side. The principal told my mom that I had refused to take the Connecticut Mastery test, suggesting this was very disruptive. My mom questioned if there was a problem, pointing out that the test form clearly stated students had the right to refuse. The principal admitted that technically this was true, but added that no one actually exercised that right. My mom responded that I just had, and from her understanding of education law, there was nothing they could do about it. The principal looked frustrated and made some calls to the school district office. They had a lot of intense conversations while my mom and I waited. Finally, some administrator from the district called back with an answer. The principal reluctantly admitted that I did have the right to refuse the test. However, they insisted that I must not encourage other students to do the same. My mom agreed that this seemed reasonable. I promised that I wouldn't tell anyone else, and just like that, I was free. Instead of suffering through those horrible tests, I got to spend that time in the library reading books I actually enjoyed. My brother found out what happened and decided to refuse the test too. I kept my promise and didn't tell other students about the refusal option. But my mom? She told every parent she knew, at school meetings, neighborhood gatherings, even at the grocery store. She spread the word about the refusal box like it was breaking news. Within a couple of years, so many parents had their kids opt out that the school district had to reconsider the whole testing program. Eventually, those Connecticut mastery tests were replaced with something less awful. I like to think my small act of rebellion made a difference. Maybe it was just one signature on one test, but sometimes the smallest actions can start the biggest changes. All I know is that by refusing to participate in a broken system, I found my voice. And that's something no standardized test could ever measure. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.